Welcome back to the briefing. There are two numbers that explain why the global energy system is now operating on the edge of structural failure, and the gap between them is not a supply disruption that can be managed with strategic reserves or alternate routes. It is a physical elimination of capacity that has no substitute available at any price. Number one, 20 million. That is how many barrels of oil transit the Strait of Hormuz every single day under normal conditions, representing approximately 20% of global oil supply. Number two, 4.2 million. That is how many barrels per day can be routed through alternate pipeline systems now that the strait has been closed to Western vessels. 20 million minus 4.2 million equals 15.8 million barrels per day that are now at direct risk with no alternate pathway to market. Let that sink in for a moment. The gap is not being filled. It cannot be filled. And the price of Brent crude just confirmed what the physical infrastructure is screaming. Oil spiked from $70 per barrel before the war began to $107 in a matter of days. And that is before we account for what happened on March 8th, 2026. Iran launched a ballistic missile strike on the Bazan refinery complex in Haifa Bay, the largest petroleum processing facility in Israel, 526 acres. That facility alone supplies 50 to 60% of Israel's domestic fuel requirements: diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, everything the economy and military need to function. The strike was executed as the 27th wave of Iran's True Promise 4 operation, launched within minutes of Israeli jets hitting fuel storage depots in Tehran and Alborz provinces. Israel's backup refinery can only produce 110,000 barrels per day. That is not enough to cover even a fraction of the shortfall. And the natural gas fields in the Mediterranean have been shut down for defensive reasons since February 28th, when the war began. Translation: Israel just lost its primary energy production capacity, and the backup system cannot replace it. Stay with me, because the fuel fires in Tehran are producing a phenomenon that has never been documented at this scale in modern warfare. The burning oil storage facilities are releasing particulates into the atmosphere that combine with moisture and fall as black rain across residential neighborhoods. This is not a temporary environmental event. This is the atmospheric signature of infrastructure destruction that will persist for weeks, coating buildings, contaminating water supplies, and creating respiratory hazards for millions of people in a city that has no evacuation plan and no shelter capacity for that population density. The same black rain that signals the scale of economic destruction is also the environmental marker of a war that has moved beyond military targets and into the systematic elimination of the industrial base that sustains civilian life. Now here's why Iran's missile capacity was never as degraded as the initial damage assessments claimed. The Khaybar-Shaikan missiles being used in these strikes are third-generation solid fuel, medium-range ballistic systems. Solid fuel reduces the launch preparation time by a factor of 6 compared to liquid-fueled predecessors. That means the missiles can be prepped and fired from concealed positions before satellite reconnaissance or signals intelligence can generate a targeting solution. The launchers are disguised as civilian cargo trucks, which makes them indistinguishable from normal traffic until the moment of launch. The missile's official range is 1,450 to 1,800 kilometers. It carries a 550 kilogram warhead, and it can execute terminal phase maneuvers at Mach 7 to Mach 10 to evade layered air defense systems. Those maneuvers happen in the final seconds before impact, which means defensive interceptors that were tracking a ballistic trajectory suddenly lose lock when the target starts maneuvering at hypersonic speeds. The intercept geometry collapses, and the defensive system has no time to recalculate. And the United States has just confirmed what every military analyst suspected, but no official would admit. American forces are reverse engineering captured Iranian drones, which cost approximately $100,000 to produce, and deploying them operationally. The original defensive calculus involved firing $2 million interceptor missiles at cheap drones, which was economically unsustainable. The new calculus involves using $10,000 counter-drone systems to bring costs into a range where sustained operations are feasible. But here is the problem. Reverse engineering the hardware is straightforward. Replicating the operational doctrine, the launch coordination, the target selection algorithms, and the saturation tactics that make the drones effective requires institutional knowledge that cannot be extracted from a captured airframe. Now consider what the Epic Fury operation was designed to achieve and what it actually produced. The operation targeted Iran's supreme leader, senior command headquarters, and communication centers with the expectation that eliminating top-level leadership would cause the regime to collapse. 8 days later, a new leader had been appointed and the command chain was intact. The reason is a concept called mosaic defense. This is a decentralized command structure where mid-level and junior commanders have the authority to make independent decisions and continue combat operations even when contact with central command is severed. The doctrine assumes that centralized command will be targeted and likely destroyed in the opening phase of any major conflict. Therefore, Operational authority is pre-delegated to unit commanders who have pre-approved rules of engagement, pre-selected target sets, and pre-authorized use of specific weapon systems. When the decapitation strike eliminates the top leadership, the distributed network continues functioning because each node was designed to operate independently. Iran maintains approximately 1 million armed personnel across regular military, police, special forces, and militia units. Even if 90% of senior leadership is eliminated, the remaining 10% can sustain operations indefinitely because decision-making authority is distributed horizontally rather than concentrated vertically. That structural resilience is why the retaliatory strikes against Tel Aviv and American bases were launched within seconds of the decapitation attempts. The orders were pre-approved, the targets were pre-selected, and the execution required no additional authorization from a central command structure that no longer existed. This is not improvisation. This is a command architecture built specifically to survive and function after the kind of strike that was just executed against it. Here is the operational reality that no amount of air superiority can overcome. The United States and its allies have conducted over 2,000 airstrikes across 26 of Iran's 31 provinces. Those strikes have reduced Iran's ballistic missile launch capacity by approximately 90%, according to official estimates. And yet the missile and drone attacks are continuing at a steady rate with increasing precision. How is that possible? Because the 10% of launch capacity that survived represents distributed, mobile camouflage systems that were designed specifically to operate in a degraded environment. Destroying 90% of static infrastructure does not eliminate the 10% that was built to survive decapitation strikes and continue firing. And when that 10% includes solid fuel missiles on mobile platforms with terminal phase maneuvering at Mach 10, the defensive problem becomes unsolvable with current technology. Now shift to what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, because this is where the global energy crisis transitions from a regional conflict to a systemic threat. The strait is now completely closed to Western vessels. Approximately 100 ships per day used to transit that choke point under normal conditions. That number is now 0 for any vessel not flagged by or affiliated with China or Iran. 20 million barrels per day of oil production in the Gulf region has exactly one pathway to global markets. And that pathway is now controlled by a government that is actively at war with the countries that need that oil. The geographic reality makes this closure nearly impossible to reverse through military means. The strait, at its narrowest point, is only 21 miles wide. Iranian coastal defenses, anti-ship missiles, and naval mines can interdict any vessel attempting passage. Clearing those defenses would require sustained air and naval operations in confined waters against land-based systems that can be replaced faster than they can be destroyed. The alternate pipeline systems can move 4.2 million barrels per day. That represents every available bypass route. Pipelines through Saudi Arabia to Red Sea terminals, routes through Turkey, connections to Mediterranean ports. All of it combined moves 4.2 million barrels. That leaves 15.8 million barrels per day with no route to market unless the strait reopens, which will not happen while the war continues. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Oman have all had oil infrastructure struck. Kuwait has halted exports entirely. Qatar declared force majeure on its LNG contracts, which means it is invoking the contractual clause that allows it to suspend deliveries due to circumstances beyond its control. That is not a temporary logistics issue. That is a formal acknowledgement that the supply agreements cannot be honored under current conditions, and that the buyers need to make alternate arrangements that do not exist. And Russia has just formalized what everyone suspected. Moscow is providing Iran with military intelligence, targeting data, and strategic guidance. That intelligence sharing is why the accuracy and effectiveness of Iranian strikes has increased significantly, even as overall launch capacity has been degraded. Russia is feeding Iran the real-time satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and target movement data that allow even a reduced number of missiles to achieve high kill probabilities against high-value targets. This is not rhetorical support. This is operational coordination at a level that makes Iran's remaining 10% of launch capacity far more dangerous than the original 100%, because every shot is now guided by intelligence that Iran's own reconnaissance capabilities could never produce. Here is what the humanitarian toll looks like when the strategy shifts from regime decapitation to infrastructure elimination. The first days of the operation saw over 2,000 airstrikes. Official casualty reports confirmed 1,332 Iranian civilians killed, including 194 children. In Lebanon, 123 people have been killed and 95,000 displaced. One strike hit an elementary school, killing over 160 people, the majority of whom were girls between 7 and 12 years old attending classes when the missile impacted the building. The attack occurred during school hours, which means the facility was clearly occupied by civilians at the time of the strike. 7 American service members have also been confirmed killed in retaliatory attacks on U.S. bases. These are not the casualty figures of a precision military operation targeting weapons facilities and command nodes. These are the casualty figures of a systematic campaign to destroy the economic infrastructure that sustains the state, and the civilian population that depends on it is absorbing the costs. The elementary school was not a military target by any definition of international humanitarian law. It was infrastructure that exists in the same geographic space as the military and industrial targets being systematically eliminated. When the strategy is infrastructure destruction rather than precision targeting, civilian casualties are not collateral damage. They are the inevitable result of the operational approach. So here's the full picture. The Strait of Hormuz is closed to Western vessels, eliminating 15.8 million barrels per day from global oil supply with no alternate route available. Israel's primary refinery, which supplies 50 to 60% of domestic fuel needs, has been destroyed, and the backup facility can only produce 110,000 barrels per day. Oil spiked from $70 to $107. Qatar declared force majeure on LNG contracts. Kuwait halted exports. Saudi infrastructure has been struck. Iran is firing missiles that maneuver at Mach 10 in terminal phase using solid fuel systems concealed as civilian trucks. Russia is providing targeting data that increases strike effectiveness despite 90% degradation of launch capacity. The United States has reverse-engineered Iranian drones but cannot replicate the operational doctrine. Iran's mosaic defense structure allows 1 million armed personnel to continue operations even with senior leadership eliminated. Over 2,000 airstrikes have killed 1,332 civilians, including 194 children. One elementary school strike killed 160 girls, and black rain is falling on Tehran from burning refineries that will contaminate the city for weeks. The strategy was regime collapse through decapitation. The result is infrastructure destruction that creates 15.8 million barrels per day of stranded oil, $107 crude prices, force majeure declarations on LNG contracts, and casualty figures that include 160 children killed in a single school strike. What happens when the global energy system loses 15.8 million barrels per day with no alternate route? What happens when Israel's primary refinery is gone and the backup produces 1/10 of requirements? What happens when mosaic defense allows distributed forces to continue firing even after 90% degradation? What happens when Russia provides the targeting data that makes the remaining 10% more effective than the original 100? The answer is in the price of oil, the force majeure declarations, and the black rain falling on residential neighborhoods. Share this now, because the gap between destroying 90% of launch capacity and stopping the attacks is not a tactical problem. It is the gap between centralized infrastructure that can be destroyed and distributed systems designed to survive and continue firing.